Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel for Great Spanish Wine. I'm Kevin Costello, and today we're going to be going through some of the most frequently asked questions that people ask when they come to our wine tastings. So I'm sitting here, it's nighttime now, but this is the terrace where we hold most of our wine tastings. The focus of the wine tastings that we do are to help people to try and discover Spanish wines. Even though the wine tasting is focused on Spanish wines, there are a lot of generic wine questions that people ask when they come to the wine tasting. So I thought we'd cover some of those in this video to try to help you get a little more basic information about wine in general. So here we go. So maybe the question that is asked the most often at the wine tastings is there really a big difference between a 20-euro bottle of wine and a 100-euro bottle of wine? And the way that I answer that is generally that the higher up in price you go, the more diminishing returns there are in terms of the difference in the quality of wine. So yes, there's most of the time a significant difference between a 20-euro bottle and a 100-euro bottle. But the higher up you go, the less those differences are, meaning that if you then compare a 30-euro bottle with a 50-euro bottle, there really isn't that much difference. If you compare a 50-euro bottle with, say, an 80-euro bottle, there's even less of a difference. And then when you get up to the ranges between 80 and 100, there really are no differences. There can be the same, and yes, it is often the case that you can taste a 20-euro bottle that tastes better and is better made than a 100-euro bottle of wine. There are a lot of things that go into the pricing of a bottle of wine. It's not just the quality of it. It could be the costs, maybe labor costs, land costs, machine costs, also the scarcity. So if it's a very, very small production, if there's a lot of difficulty in harvesting and making the wine. For instance, there are some regions where the wines are located on some very steep slopes that don't allow machinery to be used. Everything has to be hand-picked. So there's a lot of people you have to pay to help you to harvest the grapes for the wine. That elevates the cost. Then supply, demand, and marketing also go into how much a bottle of wine costs. So the quality is only part of it. And so when thinking about buying a wine, don't just be guided by the price, because you might get a bad surprise. And on the contrary, if you go for a cheap bottle of wine, it might be really, really amazing. So the price isn't everything for wine. So another question number 2 that people often ask are wines that have been aged better? And so in that case, that's a hard question to answer. It all depends. First off, when we talk about aging, aging is relative. If you're talking about 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, generally wines that have been aged for very few years, it really depends. You can get some young wines, fruitier, more full-bodied wines that are truly amazing and can be considered better than a wine that's been aged for 5 years. The one thing I will say is that the longer period of time you're looking for an aged wine, the rarer the wine is that has all the qualities necessary to be able to be aged for, let's say, 20 years. So it has to have the right level of acidity, the right amount of tannins. Structurally, it needs to be a wine of a certain composition and using some specific grapes in order for it to sustain being aged for 20 plus years. What can happen to a wine that doesn't meet those criteria is that it just breaks down, turns into vinegar, and just gets spoiled. And so you open a bottle 20 years later, and it's not even wine anymore. It's basically a bottle of vinegar. So it's not necessarily the case. It also depends on what are your preferences. If the aspect of wine that you enjoy the most is the fruit, and a wine where you can really, really get a lot of that fruit, that means you probably like younger wines. And so for that particular person, if what they're looking for is fruit and fruity wines, young is the way to go. If you're someone who likes those tertiary aromas and flavors developed in a wine, then maybe go for wines that are a little bit older. So question number 3, a lot of people ask, why do people swirl the wine? This is one that's commonly asked. People say, I see people doing this a lot with their glass of wine. Why do they do it? What does it mean? So Some people, for me, in the case when I have a glass of wine in my hand, I'm usually swirling it. It's just out of habit, but there is a purpose to swirling the wine. You're trying to give that wine some air, some oxygen. So this is mostly important for red wines and white wines that maybe have also been aged a little bit. The more time a wine has been aged, the more time it has spent in the bottle, the more that wine can sort of be closed off or very muted when the bottle is recently opened. There are wines I've even recommended in some videos that some wines need to be decanted. So all of that is because you want the wine to be mixed with some air in order for the aromas and the flavors to flourish, to come back to the surface. And so that is why when you pour wine in a glass, you swirl it. You're basically mixing it with that air so that when you put it to your nose and you give it a sip, it expresses and gives you everything that it has to give. So the next question is, what are wine legs and are they important? So wine legs, probably can't see it here, the glass is a bit too far, but also when you swirl the glass, there are these streams that flow down the edge of the glass. So these are called legs. In Spanish, they're called lágrimas, tears, which I think is a little more appropriate because they do look like teardrops falling down the side of the glass. So the legs do indicate something. It indicates whether wine is lighter or fuller bodied and the level of alcohol that the wine has. So the slower that the legs take, the longer that the legs take to flow back down to where the wine is at the bottom of the glass, the more fuller bodied and the more alcohol that wine probably has. If you swirl the glass and the legs immediately drop down and they disappear in a matter of seconds, that is a lighter bodied and less alcoholic wine. However, neither of those things by themselves are an indicator of quality. It doesn't mean that the wine is better or worse. It's just indicating one aspect that the wine has, but you really shouldn't give it too much importance. The legs, it's a nice thing to know about. Sometimes it's nice to look at. It gives you a first indication of what the wine might be like, but it's not telling you whether that's a good or bad wine. So next question is, what is a rosé? So most people who drink wine know of rosé wines, but I am quite surprised by the amount of people who ask me what a rosé wine is and how a rosé wine is made at our wine tastings. Basically, a rosé wine is a wine. So before we get into that, let's talk about how generally wine is made. So both red and white grapes, when you crush them, the liquid that comes out is transparent, see-through. It's like water. So in and of itself, you can use any type of grape to make a white wine, because if you don't mix the must from the grape with the skins, it's just going to be see-through. And so even white wines, the must is left with the skins for a very short amount of time to give it a tonality, to give it a bit of color. Red wines, you need to use red grapes for red wine because you need to mix the must with the skins, gives it that, lets go of that pigment, and it gives it that color. Also, the longer you leave it with the skins, the darker the color potentially can be within the wine. So what's a rosé? A rosé is a wine that has been left with the skins of red grapes for a short period of time, for a very short period of time, to just give it that pinkish hue, that light pink color. From then on, the rosé wine is most of the time produced, fermented, and aged the same way that a white wine is. Most rosés, what they're looking for is a lot of fruit, a lot of freshness, for it to be light. It's a drink that's very popular in the summer. It's not something that they're looking to be very full-bodied, very persistent, very dense, very rich. It's looking to be light, fruity, something easy to drink. And so it's not always exclusively red grapes that are used, but red grapes always have to be part of the equation in order to give it that pink color. So last question that we're going to tackle today is, what causes a wine to have more or less alcohol? So a lot of people, when they grab their wine, they look at the label, either the front or the back, and it gives you a percentage of alcohol present in the wine. Generally speaking, wines can range from 11 to 15%. At least here in Spain, that is the common range for the amount of alcohol present in wines. What makes that wine have more or less alcohol? Basically, the simple answer is the sun and sugar. So going a little more into detail, say you're growing grapes in a region where the sun shines a lot, there's a lot of heat and a lot of direct sunlight that shines onto the grapes. That is going to cause the grape to generate a lot of natural sugar. Then that grape is picked, crushed, and fermented, and yeast is added in that process. What the yeast does is that it eats those sugars and it turns those sugars into alcohol. So the more sugar present, the more alcohol will be produced during the fermentation process. Now, there are all kinds of winemaking techniques that can be used in order to mitigate, if you want to reduce the amount of alcohol produced. Sometimes it's picking the grape earlier in the season. Sometimes it's really cutting that fermentation process a little bit short so that there's a little residual sugar left in the wine, but less alcohol at the same time. There are some other ones that can be used as well. But that is what determines the level of alcohol. It's generally the climate, the sun, and the sugar level of the grape.